Okay, welcome everybody. I hope everybody can hear me. My name is Jorit Wintjes, and I'm researching the history of the Prussian Kriegsspiel, and I'm also a co-founder of the conflict simulation group. We are running Kriegsspiel-type war games in support of the German army and with other NATO institutions. And I'm talking a little bit about the depiction of morale in the Prussian Kriegsspiel, and particularly about how the depiction of morale changed throughout sort of the period from before 1824, when the Kriegsspiel was introduced, until, say, the beginning of the First World War. So just to give you a very brief overview over my presentation, we'll begin with a introduction, and we're going basically to the very end of the period of time I'm looking at, to 1919. And then we'll look at the early history of depicting morale, or rather not depicting morale in Kriegsspiel. And then we look at how it was actually done from 1824 onwards. And the last bit, Kriegsspiel, Mecklenburg morale, this is taking a closer look at basically at how we do this nowadays. And when that's my team and myself, when we run these Kriegsspiele, how do we actually implement morale in our facilitation? And then I'll try to sort of bind this all together in some kind of conclusion. Okay, let's go. The Bavarian General Staff does wargaming basically both in the winter period, and they do a large summer war game every summer. And they do this basically from the 1870s onwards until the beginning of the First World War. And then, of course, there is the war. In 1918, the Bavarian army basically comes home to Bavaria, and then early in 1919, the Bavarian army is dissolved, and the history of the Bavarian army basically ends. Now, what is interesting is that the Bavarian army, in the sort of short period between the end of the First World War, so we are talking November 1918, and its dissolution, which is basically end of March, beginning of April in 1919, in that short period, the Bavarian army still basically starts to again to resume the activity of wargaming. And we, by a fluke of chance, actually, we have the very last scenario that the Bavarian army is wargaming surviving. And the Bavarian army's last Kriegsspiel is about a fictional invasion of Czech forces into the sort of Bavarian, Thuringian, Saxonian border region, and the reaction of the Bavarian army. And we do not have much of the material associated with that Kriegsspiel surviving, but we do have the initial scenario and the order of battle. And it's very interesting to see. I've brought you here just a small piece from that order of battle. It's very interesting to see that they say about one of the units that are actually in the in this scenario, the 5th Infantry Division, that it is nicht verlässlich, so it's unreliable because it is contaminated by Berliners. So the idea is they are soldiers from Berlin, and they have all these crazy ideas about, democracy, republic, perhaps there are even socialists among them, and this creates a situation where the division is not very stable and is not reliable in combat. This is actually interesting for several reasons. One, as I said, being that the Bavarians, they are back from the war. They know that the Bavarian army is going to last only for a couple of days, really, but they still continue, or rather take up this activity of wargaming. So this shows how important wargaming in general is for them. And it's also very interesting because it basically says something about the sort of general status of this unit. And this is something the Bavarians and the Prussians as well have not done before the war. You will not find these comments such as, well, this is a unit that is not very reliable, this is a unit that is an elite unit. You will not find these sort of differentiations between the troop quality of different units before the war. So this is, when it comes to looking at what they actually wargame, this is actually pretty unusual. And the question is, why is that the case, and what did they do before the war? So let's go back almost a century, or rather even more than a century, and take a very brief look at the history of the Kriegsspiel and how morale actually figured in that history. So the Prussian Kriegsspiel is introduced in 1824 into the Prussian army. But the sort of concept of depicting military action by means of a board game, that's obviously much older. And in the sort of latter half of the 19th century, we actually find quite a number of persons experimenting with war games. This is a very sort of makeshift depiction of various different war games developed between the sort of 1770s and 1824. Basically, each number here stands for one war game publication. And one of the interesting things is all these were attempts at basically turning chess into something that is more suitable of depicting military operations. So what these all shared was they had maps with a checkerboard pattern. They had very simple rules with regard to depicting casualties. You basically just take pieces of your opponent's forces, and they had fairly complex rule sets. Now, if we look at them a little bit closer, we'll find, as I already said, that they carry on the heritage of chess in that you do not basically you just take your opponent's figures instead of, for example, degrading their combat capability or something like that. So the actual conflict solution in these early Kriegsspiele is a very simple one. One of the reasons for that is that the stated aim of many of these early games is to teach the principles of war. And so there is this thinking that when it comes to the general principles of war, there is really no place for morale, because these general principles, they are about things like, concentration, about certain types of maneuvers, about whatever, don't leave your flanks open and stuff like that. And of course, implementing morale in such a game is difficult anyways, so let's just leave it out completely. And it is quite interesting to see that in a Kriegsspiel published in 1812 by the father of the inventor of the Prussian Kriegsspiel, a chap called Reiswitz, and Reiswitz, the younger one, Reiswitz Jr., was the one who actually invented the Prussian Kriegsspiel then. So his father published a set of rules where you can find this very interesting sentence. This is the German original. An approximate translation reads like this: in war games, the effect of personal bravery and composure, of cold courage, which so often thwarts or diminishes the success of an attack, cannot be taken into account, and this goes without saying. Only the mechanical aspects on the one hand and ordinary success on the other could be made tangible. This means that's the only thing that I can actually depict. Therefore, it has also been assumed in its rules that the line that is attacked is at a disadvantage, and given it is of equal strength, that it is at least repulsed. So the argument here is that morale obviously has an important part in war, but it is impossible to depict, and therefore we cannot take it into account. And this is basically the most important bit here. This goes without saying. So it is self-evident that in a war game, the depiction of morale is something that is basically not possible. And most, if not all, of these early Kriegsspiele share basically this assumption. You don't even find the term morale in the word morale in these early rule sets. Now, there is one notable exception, and that is a chap from Bohemia called Opitz, who was a bank director, of all things. And he developed a Kriegsspiel that in many respects was very similar to the others, but that differed in a couple of very interesting points. He introduced dice to wargaming in order to depict losses during combat, and he also allowed for desertion, which basically is a result of morale collapsing. And he allowed for desertion in two cases. The one case was when you are actually completely far away from your lines of supply, and the other one would be during a hasty retreat. So if there is enemy action that requires you to beat a hasty retreat, then there is a chance, and this chance is resolved by a die roll. There is a chance that you are actually your soldiers will actually desert, which means they basically are taken off the board. The mechanism invented by Opitz is actually one that we, in some variation, can still find today in some tabletop war games. But the interesting thing here is he is really the exception from the rule. He's the only one of these pre-1824 war games who is actually introducing such an element into his rule set. So comes the year of 1824, and now we come to basically someone that is, he's the son of the Reiswitz, of which I already showed you this quotation, the younger one, and he basically invents the new Prussian Kriegsspiel, a Kriegsspiel that is then used in the Prussian army from 1824 onwards until 1871 and beyond. And this set of Kriegsspiel rules is then basically further developed in the 1840s, in the 1850s, and the 1860s. Again, each year that is mentioned here in this again slightly makeshift picture shows one publication of Kriegsspiel rules. The Prussians realized that due to technological progress, which is considerable in the period between 1824 and say 1871, you need to update the rules, and this is basically what they do. Just to give you one point of reference with regard to technological progress, in 1824, when the original rules were published, the standard infantry rifle in the Prussian army was not rifled, was a smoothbore musket that basically had an effective range of possibly 50, 75 meters maximum, something like that. In 1871, they introduced a new rifle where the sights only began at 200 paces, so something like 180 meters or so. So the nature of infantry combat had changed beyond recognition, and yet they still used the Kriegsspiel, something that was developed in 1824. So it had to be updated, and this is what we can see here. Now, in 1824, this Kriegsspiel developed by Reiswitz Jr. was breaking with tradition in a very considerable way. For the first time, you did not have maps that used, checkerboard patterns, but the Prussian Kriegsspiel used topographic maps, which is certainly one reason for its adoption by the Prussian army, because it meant that if you wanted to take part in a Prussian Kriegsspiel, you had to be able to read a map. And while nowadays basically everybody can or should be able to read a map, back in 1824, that was decidedly not the case. Topography was something that was very new. And indeed, the chief of the Prussian General Staff, general called Müffling, basically the highest ranking Prussian soldier, he also was Prussia's chief topographer. He had introduced topography to the Prussian army. He was responsible for the very first topographic survey of the Prussian army. So probably the minute Reiswitz broke out his topographic map, and the minute Müffling realized you have to use a topographical map for the Kriegsspiel, he was already sort of half sold to the idea of introducing this to the army. Then Reiswitz broke with tradition because he used tokens that were in the same scale to the map. So you use a map in a scale of, say, 1 to 8,000, And the tokens representing, for example, battalions or batteries of artillery, they are in the same scale. At least they have the same width such a unit would take up in the field, which allows you to at least get a vague idea about, for example, how many batteries you can actually put on a hilltop. Because if you cannot fit the tokens on the hilltop, you can't fit. You are not likely to be able to fit the guns in reality. This, of course, made it possible to depict sort of maneuvers with the tokens and the maps. And this is something that in Prussia at the time certainly was very attractive, because when we think about the Prussian army, we usually think about this very competent and very large thing from the sort of latter half of the 19th century. But in 1824, it was third rate at best and starved of money and basically never went into the field, even in peacetime. There is a famous military theoretician, Karl von Decker, who complained in the 1830s that in 8 years as a brigade commander, he did not get to fire one single shot with his artillery. So he didn't know how his artillery would behave in the field, because they actually did zero exercises. And the third important break, obviously, is the introduction of a facilitator. So the participants only give orders, and the facilitators then they put the orders into effect and report back to the participants. So you have this sort of double-blind situation that makes Kriegsspiel ideal to expose participants to, for example, to the fog of war, and it also has the big advantage of being highly accessible. You do not have to learn rules in order to take part in Kriegsspiel. The facilitators have to know the rules, but the participants just have to make decisions. So Reiswitz breaks with tradition. He also breaks with tradition with regard to the effects of combat on morale, because now this is actually implemented. And the way he does this is quite interesting. So you have your unit, for example, let's assume you have a battalion of infantry, and this battalion of infantry is now involved in combat. And then the outcome of the combat that is decided by the facilitators has an effect on the status of this battalion. So there are 3 different status, if you want, that could be the result of could be the outcome of combat. That would be you are basically the enemy has compelled you to pull back in good order. That would be zum Rückzug gedrängt, or R for Rückzug. G for geschlagen means you are retreating and not really in good order, and it takes quite a while to put your battalion together again for renewed action. And T for total geschlagen means basically your battalion has been routed and is no longer combat effective for the foreseeable time. So what we have here is that the effect of rifle fire, of gunfire, and of close combat, the effect on the continuing capability or ability of a unit to again enter combat is depicted by these 3 categories. Obviously, if you win, then these don't apply to you. Later in the 19th century, we can see that these categories are in some ways also applied to the winning side. So you could, in theory, win and basically rout your enemy, but have losses of such a magnitude that you are actually not considered combat capable for, let's say, a couple of hours. Just to show you how this actually works in practice. So Reiswitz in 1824, he has special dice designed for him, where you have all these pieces of information basically on specially designed dice. Now, from the 1840s onwards, the Prussians basically use standard D6 instead, and 2 tables. 2 decision tables. This is the first one, and I'll show you the second one in a minute. So let's assume we have a situation where 4 battalions attack 5 battalions. So what you now would do as a facilitator is you would look at the sort of numerical relationship between the two forces fighting. So I have 4 versus 5. You can see that there is a in the upper line I have 1 to 11. That would be sort of the numerical relationship, the attacker to the defender, and on the left hand side I also have 1 to 11. So I have 4 to 5. So the defender, in that case, if these 4 battalions attack, the defender has a slight advantage. And then there is this Roman numeral 2. And this means now I take my d6 and the second decision table, which is this one. And there you can see that the Roman numerals on the left-hand side, they are basically related to die results. Let's assume you take your you take your d6, and the attacker in that case attacks with 4 battalions, so he has a lesser chance of success. So in that case, the attacker would be red. I throw the die, and let's say I roll a 2. That would be one of these gray bits, and that would mean that the attack has been repulsed, was not successful. And what we can see here is that the losing side now is R, so is pushed back, and the numbers above and below the letter, these are information that you require in order to calculate the losses. So I have these 2 tables, and the basic principle behind that is I'm always looking at the numerical relationship of the forces involved. Now, if there is, the example I now gave you is something for basically combat in open field. If you have topography influencing the combat, then you would adjust the table. You would then, for example, say, okay, these 5 battalions are in a very disadvantageous position. So that would mean that I'm adjusting the numerical relationship of 4 to 5 to, let's say, 5 to 5, because the attacker is in a very advantageous position, something like that. So you can tinker around with the numerical relationship, and once you have basically fixed this, then you go to this part of the decision table and then decide of the outcome of the combat. And you're probably already realizing where this all goes to. Of course, if you have as a basis the numerical relationship and then modify this with topography and other things, you can also use the sort of current status of the unit. Let's say the unit was forced to retreat in a prior skirmish, and you can say, okay, they not only suffered losses, but they are also slightly shaken, and I take that into account when calculating the final sort of numerical relationship between the 2 units. What's interesting is that the Kriegsspiel, basically all these Kriegsspiel rules, they do not consider these status changes to be permanent. Rather, units can rally after some time, at least those that are retreating. A rout requires quite a bit of time to rally, so that is that's quite a difficult thing. But you can return to basically full capability from a retreat. That is in theory possible. Now, let's go beyond the sort of original Kriegsspiel and look at what happens in the 1870s. And this brings us to this chap, Jakob Clemens Meckel, who is if you want, the most important Kriegsspiel and, if you want, wargaming theoretician in the sort of latter half of the 19th century. There are others, for example, the later Prussian army minister Verdu du Vernois, but Meckel is the one who is, I would argue, most clearly actually thinking through the possibilities and the limitations of wargaming and of the Kriegsspiel as an educational tool. And he publishes in 1873 his studies on the Kriegsspiel, and in that he addresses a couple of things that he considers to be shortcoming. And one of these things is the depiction of the effect of gun and artillery fire, And this is from his 1873 publication, again, a rough translation of that. He says that the great factors of discipline, virtuosity, enthusiasm, and ambition, so that would be morale in a positive sense. However powerful the driving force may be, they have had to learn to bow to the irresistible moral forces of fire. So his argument is, in a Kriegsspiel, we have to look very closely at the effect of rifle and artillery fire, particularly on an attacking force. And he considers this to be, on the one hand, to be very important, has to be done by the facilitators. And on the other hand, that is basically the greatest challenge because it is inherently very complex. And he gives one very interesting example. You have a company that is attacking a numerically inferior, significantly inferior enemy, and there is, some defensive fire, and 10 soldiers in that company are killed, and the rest charges onwards and overwhelms the enemy. And then you have the same company attacking, and again, the same situation, and 10 soldiers are killed. The company commander, his second in command, and the most popular soldiers of the rankers, and the attack stalls. Everybody throws themselves down, and nothing happens. The problem is how to depict that in a war game, how to depict that in Kriegsspiel. So there is a lot of thinking about how to depict morale, and it is very, very interesting to see that they completely blank out one aspect that we nowadays would consider to be quite important as well, and that is the aspect of sort of the sort of general status the unit has at the very beginning before it enters combat. You remember the Bavarians at the very beginning of my presentation, and the thing with the Berliners who are this unit that is actually contaminated by Berliners. This is something you will not find in the 19th and early 20th century, and it's also not mentioned by Meckel. So at the very beginning of combat, everybody is always in perfect condition, and there is no account made for differences in troop quality, in training, etc. And that is quite interesting. Now, what Meckel says is the lack of a sufficient depiction of morale is a key defect in existing Kriegsspiel rules, as already said, and facilitators have to take this into account in a way that is basically more detailed than has so far been done when using the Kriegsspiel. That was one of the points Meckel made. But as I said, there is no discussion of troop quality. So there is no differentiation, for example, between guard units, regular units, reserve units, something like that. These differences are simply completely blanked out. Morale is just seen as something that is the result of combat. And as we have seen in 1919, this has obviously changed. There we have a war game, a Kriegsspiel, where you actually have information on the quality of the forces involved at the very beginning. Now, just to show you how this can be done, and this would be from our experience. This is from a wargame run at the logistics school of the German Army. We have the scenario is a French invasion in Britain, and we have here British colonial forces, so that's actually Canadians trying to fend off French forces attacking towards, in that case, towards Sandwich. And what you basically do is, this is a modern decision table for a Meckel type Kriegsspiel. What you basically do is you adjust, or you basically factor in the troop quality at the very beginning. So just to take as an example this 4 versus 5 battalion situation, if you take 4 battalions versus 5 battalions and both are regular, and you assign the sort of combat value of 1 to them, then you have 4 versus 5. That would be the numerical relationship, and you end up with on the dice table with the number 2. If the 4 battalions are volunteers and you assign a combat value of 0.75 to the volunteers, then you would end up at a numerical relation of 3 to 5, and if you have, let's say, an elite unit, you end up with a numerical relation of 6-5. So, and this would then be the dice. This would be in the dice table the number 2, but in favor of the attacker, actually. So it is easily possible, because the fundamental principle in the Prussian Kriegsspiel is this numerical, the sort of modification of the numerical relationship. It is easily possible to actually implement the troop quality even before combat starts. And we usually use only these 3 differences: volunteers, regulars, and elite units. But you can actually basically use more differentiations. You can use volunteer, regular, experienced, elite, and volunteer, and irregular units. This is all fairly easily possible if you use the system of modifying the troop numbers with these combat value factors. Okay, so let's try to slightly tie this all together. I think when we talk about morale in Kriegsspiel, particularly in the Prussian Kriegsspiel, the first important thing is, just if we look at the history of it all, before 1824, nobody, with the notable exception of this Bohemian bank director, nobody actually cared for morale. They were interested in mechanics, they were interested in tactics, in wheeling around units on their checkerboard pattern battlefields, and morale simply did not play a role. And then the Prussian Kriegsspiel comes in 1824, and all of a sudden morale actually plays a role, as basically the effect, the outcome of combat. So if you lose, that will have an effect on your morale, and will have an effect on how a unit can be used in the next few hours. And this is actually depicted in these rules in a fairly simple way, but at least it is in there. We can then see in the 1870s that there is, particularly as a result of the War of 1870-1871, there is an acute awareness of the impact rifle and artillery fire can have on, particularly on attacking infantry. And there is unease about how this is depicted in Kriegsspiel. And there's the idea that it should be possible to basically increase the importance of that factor, and that would mean basically having the facilitators implement this to a greater degree. What is very interesting is that differences in troop quality are mostly ignored. This is probably due to the fact that the Kriegsspiel also ignores differences in, for example, equipment. Right until the beginning of the First World War, the Prussians and then the Germans, the Bavarians, basically everybody in Germany who does Kriegsspiel, they always only fight against each other. They always only use basically the blue team's equipment, if you want. There is no red teaming. There is no attempt at depicting different, say, technological capabilities. And it may be from that thinking that that this sort of ignorance of different troop qualities actually comes from. This seems to change as a result of the First World War, as we have seen in this Bavarian war game from 1919, where we actually have different troop qualities, basically in the initial order of battle, where there are units that are highlighted as reliable and others are highlighted as rather unreliable. However, as I've also shown you, the basic combat resolution mechanism in Kriegsspiel allows for easily including troop qualities at the very beginning of a game, because all you have to do is basically tinker around with the numerical relationships between units, and you basically just have to assign different combat value modifiers to the actual numerical strength of various units. And if you do that, then you can actually depict morale in Kriegsspiel fairly well, at least in such a way that it still can be used nowadays in a quite useful way. Okay, that's from me. Thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, please go. Okay, so I see one question here about how often or how frequently staffs used war games or used Kriegsspiel war games in formal settings. And the answer to that is, for example, for the Bavarians, they do this very often. Basically, once every summer, at least from the 1890s onwards, and they also do this. From during the winter period, basically in every winter. So this is done in Bavaria. It is very often done at basically every divisional school. So wargaming and Kriegsspiel-type wargaming is an activity that by the sort of 1860s is fairly common in the German army. One of the problems that is actually quite interesting. One of the problems that we see on the level of the general staff is that they in the very early 20th century, so let's say around 1905, there is apparently a tendency to shy away from actually gaming it all through. So they prepare for a Kriegsspiel, they lay out their initial plans, and then they discuss these plans, but they actually do not go to the effort of actually playing it through. And there is some in 1905, there is when Schlieffen then goes, and in 1906 he is followed by Moltke the Younger. He then tries to basically actively promote playing out the scenarios again in the general staff. So the probabilities for Reiswitz and Schischwitz, that is a very interesting question. The probabilities for close combat probably come from the imagination of the wargames designers, not to say they pulled it out of their posterior, but there's no information surviving of how they actually came up with that. When it comes to the to casualties and weapons effects, Reiswitz at least says that his results come from observing actual weapons tests. Reiswitz was a young artillery officer. He served on the Artillery Testing Commission, and he also claims in the preface to his rules that the effectiveness of artillery is specifically based on tests done by Scharnhorst that were published in 1813. What is quite interesting is if you look at the actual publication by Scharnhorst and at the actual test results and compare the probabilities there with the probabilities in the Reiswitz rule set, you'll find that there was actually a disconnect. And Reiswitz basically, probably because he was an artilleryman, basically increased the probability of artillery to create casualties as opposed to these real life and real world tests. I mean, at the very end, one of the key issues is you have to bear in mind the Kriegsspiel is from, say, the 1860s onwards, mostly used for training decision makers. And in that context, it is mostly used, or usually used, for basically confronting participants with a situation where they have to make decisions, possibly a fast-moving situation, one where their initial plans have gone awry and where they have to make new plans on basically while they're actually in the game. And in that context, sort of the nuts and bolts of the actual weapons capabilities, they are not that important. Rather, what is important is how do you actually react to, let's say, something that goes wrong, or how do you react, on the other hand, to success? Are you able to exploit that? What's your decision-making process? How do you process information and something like that? What you can see is, for example, when we run these Kriegsspiel-type war games, for example, with army officers, that is for educational purposes, but we run them with scenarios from the 19th century. Because this is not about depicting technology properly. This is basically about looking at how you work together in a team as a staff, how your information process works, and how your decision-making process works. So that may be one of the reasons why in the sort of latter half of the 19th century, the Prussians were okay with not having a very sort of scientific and empirical foundation for the probabilities. So I'll just have to look at these. Okay, thank you very much. Then enjoy the rest of the conference.